This week, we're taking you to the beating heart of economics, to one of its most important concepts, crucial for driving long-term growth, and something that has confounded policymakers and economists for years. Productivity. It's all part of the service here on Reuters Econ World. We pick a buzzword or phrase and look at the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, productivity. And why Europe is desperate to crack its code. I'm Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. Productivity is one of those concepts that looks so simple on paper. It boils down to how much output workers can produce in a given time with the available technology. And a country's long-term economic growth depends almost entirely on boosting it. So what's the recipe for success? In theory, improvements in skills, technology, and investment will get you there. But the truth is, even measuring productivity, let alone expanding it, is tricky. With its share of the global economy shrinking, it's a puzzle Europe is desperate to solve. Here's European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in April.
In the last decade, Europe's labour productivity has risen by only 0.8% per year, compared to 1.1% in the United States. These trends can only be addressed with a concerted effort of both the European and the national level, and therefore restoring our competitive edge must be at the heart of Europe's economic agenda of 2024 and beyond.
So can they do it? Here to discuss that and other weighty matters, like the misery of the self-service till in the grocery store,
select payment type.
I'm delighted to have our European economics editor, Mark John. Hey, Mark.
Hi, Carmel. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm so glad you're here for this. Mark, boosting productivity has always been important, but it feels like, globally, with falling birth rates and aging populations, that it's never been more important. Bluntly put, if we've got less workers, then we all need to be more productive.
Yep, I think that, in fact, you actually had a guest on your show a couple of weeks or so ago, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. He once famously said, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything.
Right.
And what he meant by that was that it's basically about what we as humans get up to when we get out of bed every day and what we make of our time in terms of economic terms, and we are able to put into an economy and society as a whole.
And we seem to be particularly worried about it in Europe, Mark. Like, we seem to be very worried that we have fallen behind our US cousins, right?
Yes, I think that this goes hand in hand with the question of Europe's aging populations. I think that while populations are aging pretty much everywhere, among advanced economies, Europe's is aging to a greater extent than the United States at the moment. And this has led to labour shortages, which are really kind of raising question marks about sort of whether certain sectors are actually going to be able to continue as they are at the moment. And Europe, with its kind of traditionally high priority on welfare state, is facing questions about whether or not it will actually be able to afford this in future. So it's a massive question, I think, for Europe at the moment and for European politicians.
How is Europe going to tackle this?
Well, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because productivity really, it takes so many different variables, so many different factors. It's almost a kind of a measure of what sort of economy you have, how efficiently it's running. It takes in, for example, how well management are doing.
Mm-hmm.
It takes into account things like the smoothness of your industrial relations, whether your infrastructure, like transport and communications, are working properly, whether you're investing enough in skills, and whether your capital markets are actually doing the job of financing the economy. So yeah, it's a huge challenge. I don't think anyone thinks there's a kind of a silver bullet that can put this thing right just like that.
It's one of those concepts in economics that seems deceptively simple: output per worker. So, like, from a very basic perspective, should we all just work longer then, right? Like to raise the output. I know that's a debate that's happening in Germany, potentially extending the working day there. They have the shortest working hours, I think, among industrial nations. Is that a solution? Or then I think recently we've had talk about a 4-day week. We should all be working smarter, right? Like that's these questions over longer working hours. Is that the solution?
Yeah, well, probably not really. I mean, if you measure productivity in terms of, sort of production per worker, then yeah, absolutely. If you get a worker to work a bit longer, then you're going to get a higher productivity level and you're going to get more output, obviously up to a certain point.
Yeah.
Question is, do you want that as a society? Because you're going to balance that against various other societal and political priorities. And as we know, for example, in Europe, I think the consensus has been that actually people don't want to work as long as they are in other economies, like notably America.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one for the politicians. Certainly work smarter, I think, is absolutely a route through. If you can look at your workflows and pack in the same amount of value into fewer hours, then yeah, absolutely. Not only are you potentially raising productivity and overall output, but you're probably doing various good things for your quality of life and your work-life balance as well.
Mm-hmm. The other question is immigration. Is that the solution? Like if we're facing declining fertility and aging populations, should we try and attract more workers?
I mean, I think it can be part of the answer. I mean, I think there are a lot of labour market experts who would suggest that plugging gaps in labour markets with foreign workers is a sort of a short-term fix, in the sense that, if you've got a sector that is clearly lacking in the skill base domestically, and it takes years potentially to build that skill base up, then it makes sense to offer visas to workers to come from elsewhere and to plug those gaps.
And we've spoken about US versus Europe, but actually, what does the data show when it comes to productivity stats?
Yeah, so the data is interesting, potentially sometimes a bit misleading.
Mm-hmm.
So there is on the website of the International Labour Organization a chart entitled "Which country has the highest labour productivity?" and they measure it in terms of GDP divided by hours worked and then adjusted for the cost of living in the various countries.
Yeah.
So last year, it was actually Luxembourg that came top with $146 per hour worked.
I don't think anyone would have got that in a pub quiz, right? Luxembourg wouldn't have been anyone's top choice, right?
Perhaps not.
No disrespect. It's just...
No.
Yeah.
It's the way it pans out. Country dear to your heart, Ireland next with $143.
Another surprise.
Norway next with $93. And then US coming in at 70, and Germany and France both at 68, all three below Singapore and $74.
Huh.
But, what does this mean?
Yeah. Because that's showing the US as kind of like mid-table.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. And this is where we get this statistical thing. Luxembourg, Ireland, Norway, countries with relatively small populations. So the actual base of the hours worked is going to be much, much less than in the US, Germany, or France. But they have different factors that make up their economy. In Luxembourg, you've got a very big financial sector, lots of banks, lots of also cross-border workers coming in to boost output as well. Ireland, as you know, it's the basis for a lot of multinationals who are booking a lot of their business in Ireland.
Yep.
And so that bumps up the GDP almost to make it useless. So on that level, then, we have to take the data with a bit of a pinch of salt. That being said, we've also got other ways of measuring, for example, productivity growth. And certainly policymakers, I think there's a degree of consensus among policymakers that over the last decade or so, and particularly over the last few years around the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, US productivity has grown faster than that in Europe. And there was, some people have called it even the kind of a mini boom in productivity coming out of the pandemic in the US that people are still trying to work out what was going on.
Right. We don't know the answer.
Not really. No. I mean, the Federal Reserve would love to know the answer for absolute certain, because it kind of, it really actually would help them understand how they treat inflation. Another question that the US has been grappling with is the extent to which it's actually recording all of the hours being worked by its population. And, for example, whether foreign workers are being properly included in the statistics.
Okay.
If they're not, again, because their output will be recorded, but not the hours worked, that will also boost productivity in a way which is not necessarily accurate.
Yeah.
The big question would be the extent to which companies, workers have managed to actually change their work practices during this period and are actually, as you put it, working smarter.
I mean, one aspect to all of this and related to smarter working is technology. There have been examples throughout history of it boosting productivity, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, clearly, we've had steam age, we've had the discovery of electricity and how that then has been applied to the economy and so on.
Mm-hmm.
What's kind of interesting is that you don't often get these kind of benefits coming through immediately and certainly not evenly.
Right.
So sometimes you have to wait for years, if not decades, before people work out how to actually use these technologies to the benefit of the economy.
Right.
And yeah, I think as we're going with this question, we're going to have to see how that applies to the whole question of automation and particularly the claimed benefits of artificial intelligence as well.
Right. Well, there's some big expectations there, isn't there, around what AI could do for us?
I think it's fair to say there are some enormous expectations.
Yeah.
I think the IMF is saying it could add something like 0.8 percentage points to the global economy, which is colossal, if that's the case.
Huge.
Yeah. So there is also in this the question as to, who benefits, how is it going to change the way that we work, how is it going to change workers' rights, how is it going to change employment levels and so on. I think it's fair to say that this is going to be one of the big questions for productivity and for work over the coming years.
Technology definitely isn't a panacea. Like, if you look at an economy like Japan, it's high tech, but its productivity levels have been quite weak for some time. And we've all encountered, I think, technology that doesn't feel like it's doing us any favours. Mark, we have a section in each week's show of a real-world example, and I think we've got something this week that will possibly resonate with lots of us. And it involves a trip to the self-service checkout at the local supermarket.
That's the one.
Please wait for assistance.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think actually this very example was mentioned in a recent book by MIT economists as one classic example where you get something, a piece of technology which has questionable benefits and certainly doesn't really seem to be doing much good in terms of productivity or in the widest terms in terms of the efficiency and the kind of the general comfort of the overall shopping experience.
Please take your items.
And we've all been there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of despite the fact that we can actually scan for ourselves and so on, why is it that in our local supermarket people still seem to be queuing up? And it's because of this general problem around the application of a given technology and how it fits into other workflows and how it fits into what people want. So yeah, it's a very small, but it's a very tangible example of what we're talking about is the question mark over what sort of gain you can get from technologies.
Mm-hmm. We've all had that sinking feeling when we've seen the person ahead of us in the queue with their unweighed fruit and veg or
Exactly.
particular item from the deli that doesn't have a barcode. It resonates. But I suppose shops introduce it because it cuts costs, right? It means that they don't have to employ as many workers. So maybe the benefit isn't for the consumer perhaps, but for the retailer?
Have you scanned your reward card?
Well, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess in the kind of the application envisaged by the supermarket is what you're doing is you're actually sort of getting the shopper to do some of the work for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is great because you don't have to pay the shopper.
Use the PIN pad to complete transaction.
I mean, the other issue with technology is, and I don't know if there's much in the way of research around this, is the question to which it also becomes a distraction, particularly for us, those of us who are office-based, but whose phone is right beside us and maybe, not speaking about myself or anyone, but you can find yourself suddenly scrolling down your Instagram feed during a work meeting.
Well, indeed.
What's the research around that? Is technology could be counterproductive?
I don't even know if researchers have dared to research extensively into that one, actually. I'm afraid of what they might find.
Right.
While I haven't seen any data, I think anecdotally, we all know this is a thing, right?
Yeah.
Don't know what the answer is, but certainly I think we can all assume that technology also has the power to distract and therefore to make us a little bit less productive as well.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we're going to be talking about this for a long time because of the things we mentioned.
Yeah.
The aging of societies, but also the promise of automation technologies. What interests me is how it's then going to fit into other preoccupations that we have at the moment. And I think the biggest one of all in many ways actually is how this relates to the challenge of climate change. And then there is a kind of a style of debate as to how you incorporate environmental considerations into a more holistic measure of what productivity is.
Mm-hmm. And what economic growth is, by extension.
Exactly. And it kind of,
Yeah.
it offers the promise of squaring the circle so that you get economic growth on the one hand, which is sustainable. So if you can actually, I guess, find a way of measuring it and helping policymakers to come up with changes to our economy that delivers that, then that would be a huge advance.
So on that positive note, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you, Carmel.
And thank you for listening. I hope you found it a productive use of your time. Every week here on Reuters Econ World, we try to tease out one economic principle behind the news. There's a newsletter to accompany the show. You can subscribe to it on Reuters.com. Till next week, a big thank you to Mark John and everyone who covers economics at Reuters. Sound design for this show was by Josh Summer. Leela de Kretzer is our executive producer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Jonah Green, Christopher Walljasper, David Spencer, and Gail Issa. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins. For all your daily news, check out Reuters World News, our weekday podcast.